Good. Okay. This here is a cross-sagittal section view of the integumentary system. It's a compository slide going directly through the center of the integument, the skin. What we're looking at here is the different layers of the skin, the integument. There's three primary layers here. At the most superficial layer, we'd be looking at the epidermis. Distal to that, we'd be looking at the dermis. And most inferior to that, we'd be looking at the hypodermis layer. The dermal layer is actually the largest layer of all the skin tissue in the body. It's primarily composed of all the structural functional units that we'll find in this layer, in the reticular layer. The anterior portion, or the superior portion of the dermal layer, is actually the 20% of that is going to be the papillary layer, attaching the dermal pegs and the epidermal pegs and the dermal papillae to each other, attached by areolar connective tissue. And the other 80% is actually reticular layer, where all the structural units would be found. The difference going up to the superficial portion of the epidermis, we'll be looking at the difference between thick and thin skin. Over here on this side, you'd see thick skin present with the layers of stratum corneum, which is a structural layer that consists of about 20 to 30 different layers. And on the thin side, we'd be missing that layer of stratum lucidum. And as we can see here in the depiction of the model, there are hair follicles present in thin skin, whereas on thick skin we don't see any hair follicles. We find thick skin in the palms of our hands and on the soles of our feet. The difference in between these two layers of thin and thick skin would be the stratum layers. At the most superior portions, going from superior to inferior, we'd be starting off with the stratum corneum. The next little layer right here, where you can see the yellow line going through, is the stratum lucidum. It's only present in thick skin. As you see over here, we don't see it on the thin side. It's only present in thick skin, the palms of our hands, soles of our feet. Deep to that, we'd be looking at the stratum granulosum. It's consistent of probably 5 to 7 layers of cells. Deep to that, we'd be looking at the stratum spinosum, and then most inferior, which is about 1 row of cells, would be the stratum basale, or the stratum germinativum. As the name implies, that's the most actively mitotic cell layer within all the stratum layers of the epidermis. So coming down from up above would be the epidermal pegs, and then coming up above from down below would be the dermal papillae, and these are what are responsible for our fingerprints, as you can see here on the far right lateral side of the model. Going distal to that layer, the epidermal layer, we'll now go into the dermal layer. The dermal layer primarily is consistent of 2 zones, which, as I mentioned before, is the papillary layer. The first 20% and the other 80% is the reticular layer, where we'll find most of the other functional units, such as glands. Those glands are going to be an eccrine or merocrine sweat gland. And this sweat gland is a thermoregulatory gland. It's actually going to protrude all the way through the apical surface of the epidermis and go out through an integumental pore where sweat would be released, sodium chloride or urea, in the function of cooling the body down and getting us back to homeostatic balance. We also see Meissner corpuscles here, these tiny little white projections, and those are responsible for fine touch reception within the fingertips when we're touching or gliding our hands against things. We see Pacinian corpuscles here. This is a Pacinian corpuscle. Its functional capability is responsible for pain pressure receptors in the distal portion of the skin, which is found in the hypodermal layer. Here, as we see on this model, we have an apocrine gland, and this is this model here is just a compository model. It shows everything, but typically we wouldn't find this apocrine gland in a normal portion of the integument. It's usually found in the genital area or the armpits, the axillary area. This apocrine gland is going to break off at the apical surface and release its content, secreting pheromones onto the apical surface of the axillary region. The dermal layer is also highly innervated with subpapillary plexes and arteries and veins, highly vascularized with blood supply. One of the things that would affect homeostatic balance would be the fact that if any restriction would occur in the blood supply to this area, it would result in a decubitus ulcer or stage 1, stage 2, or stage 3 pressure ulcer in the skin, dead skin supply. Also, there is a hair follicle here. This hair follicle is going to protrude through the apical surface of the integument as well, where we see 3 different layers of it. Protruding out the most superficial layer would be the hair shaft. Moving distal to that, we'd find the actual hair follicle surrounded by a hair bulb, and in the most inferior portion of that, we'd be looking at the actual hair root, where the hair is formulated via the follicular development that's occurring on the inside of that structure. On the outside of that structure, we'd be looking at a sebaceous gland. It's going to secrete sebum, which is oil, onto the apical surface of the integument for fine lubrication of the hair. And it serves also as a protection mechanism. It's a natural gloss produced by the body. We also see this apocrine gland, merocrine gland, this sweat gland, also this specialized structure here at the far left of this model, which is a erector pili muscle. It's smooth muscle, and it actually functions pretty neatly because it's attached to the hair follicle, but yet it's also attached to this papillary layer, and it works when we're contracting, when we go out into cooler environments and we need to produce body heat. The erector pili muscle, which is attached to each individual hair strand, is actually going to contract and cause the hair strand or the hair shaft to arise and stand in an erect position. We see this a lot in cats, which get scared. Their hair stands up erectly and gives them that appearance of being more larger than they actually are, which is a defense mechanism for them. Deep to the dermal layer, we're looking at the hypodermal layer or the subcutaneous layer, which is primarily containing adipose tissue produced by adipocytes, fat tissue here. If we go any more deeper than that, we'd be reaching muscle tissue and some of the lumen structures that would be provided in this section. We'd find 3rd-degree burns in this area. 1st-degree burns, 2nd-degree burns, and 3rd-degree burns. The difference would be 1st-degree burns would affect all of the epidermal tissue up here at the most superior portion of this model. 2nd-degree burns would then affect past the epidermis into the dermal layer. And 3rd-degree burns completely sabotages through the epidermis, the dermis, and affects the subcutaneous layer. Any more further damage than that, we'd be going into muscle or even bone in more invasive situations. Going back to the epidermis layer, the most superficial layer, we'd be looking at the most active, mitotically active layer, which is the stratum germinativum or the stratum basale, where the formation of melanocytes, which is one of the type of cells. We'll find a variety of different cells in this area or this location region. Those cell types would be melanocytes, which create the pigment melanin in darker hued colored people of the earth. And that melanin is, and also in pale colored people as well, that melanin is responsible for UV protection against UV radiation, ultraviolet radiation, UV light exposure. And it works functionally because it actually protects the nuclei from damaging sun rays, the violently damaging sun rays that can occur and completely damage the skin. But because we have that melanin, it protects the nuclei and keeps abrasion from happening. Going up into the stratum granulosum or stratum spinosum, which is an active, the second actively mitotic layer, we find keratinocytes. Those keratinocytes are going to push up to the apical surface, kind of continue to go through the layers and move and elevate upward to the outermost layer of the stratum corneum, where they will no longer be actively mitotic cells in that the stratum granulosum stratum portion of this of the layers of the skin in regards to the epidermis. So in conclusion, we're looking at the epidermis, the epidermal pegs, the dermal papillae, which are responsible for fingertip thumbprints. We have the Meissner's corpuscles, which are responsible for fine touch reception in the skin. We're looking down here. This green structure is a Pacinian corpuscle, responsible for pain and pressure reception. It's surrounded by adipose connective tissue. Anything further than that is muscle tissue. At the anterior or the superior portion of this model, it's in the dermal, in the papillary layer, we'd be dealing with areolar connective tissue. In the dermal region, we'd be dealing with dense, irregular connective tissue, a variety of different tissues here. And distal to the most inferior portion, we'd be finding adipose tissue in the subcutaneous layer. Hair follicles, hair shaft, hair root, sebaceous gland producing sebum, apocrine gland that produces pheromones in the axillary and genital regions of the body, subpapillary plexi, and a variety of sensory nerve fibers that would be responsible for contractility and excitability of this tissue as well. That's it. Study.